Carroll O'Connor was not a man who held grudges lightly. He believed in discipline, loyalty, and respect, not just in life but in the work itself. To millions of viewers, he was the heart of one of television's most influential shows, a performer whose presence felt unshakable. But behind the success, behind the laughter, there was one relationship that quietly collapsed and never recovered. And for the rest of his life, Carroll O'Connor made one decision that spoke louder than any accusation. He never said that name again. The chemistry that built a legacy. When All in the Family first aired, few could have predicted how deeply it would cut into the American conscience. The show did not arrive gently. It challenged assumptions, provoked arguments, and forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about class, race, and generational conflict. At the center of it all stood Carroll O'Connor as Archie Bunker, loud, rigid, opinionated, and impossible to ignore. He was not meant to be lovable, yet somehow he was human enough that audiences leaned in instead of turning away. Opposite him was a younger presence, sharper and more agile in tone, playing Archie's son-in-law, Mike Stivic. On screen, their dynamic was electric. Every argument felt real, every pause deliberate. They were not just trading jokes, they were performing a cultural collision in real time. Viewers did not tune in simply to laugh. They tuned in to watch two worldviews collide at the dinner table. The chemistry worked because it felt lived in, not manufactured. Behind the scenes, that chemistry did not come from ease. Carroll O'Connor approached acting with near-surgical precision. He dissected scripts, questioned motivations, and obsessed over rhythm. To him, Archie Bunker was not a caricature. He was a constructed human being whose contradictions had to remain intact for the show to mean anything. O'Connor believed that if Archie became too broad, too preachy, or too simplified, the entire moral balance of the series would collapse. His co-star came from a different place. Younger, outspoken, and intellectually driven, he increasingly saw the show as a vehicle for broader statements. He was less interested in subtlety and more willing to let the message lead the performance. Early on, these differences stayed manageable. Disagreements happened during rehearsals, but professionalism held. Crew members later recalled that nothing ever exploded. It simmered. As ratings climbed and the show became a cultural force, that simmer grew hotter. Creative debates turned sharper. O'Connor began to feel that the heart of Archie Bunker, flawed but layered, was being slowly pushed aside in favor of something more confrontational and ideological. Still, the work never suffered. Scene after scene, the two men delivered performances that felt inseparable, as if tension itself had become part of the fabric of the show. What audiences did not realize was that this balance depended on restraint, and restraint does not last forever. When creative tension became personal. As All in the Family moved deeper into its run, the success that should have unified its cast began to expose fault lines instead. Carroll O'Connor was no longer just the lead actor. He had become a guardian of the show's internal logic. He understood that Archie Bunker only worked if the audience was allowed to wrestle with him, not simply reject him. That required discipline, restraint, and above all, consistency. Every shift in tone mattered. Behind the scenes, O'Connor increasingly pushed back on scripts that he felt drifted too far toward moral sermonizing. According to multiple crew members, he requested rewrites when dialogue felt designed to score points instead of reveal character. These were not tantrums. They were measured objections, often delivered privately, grounded in craft. Writers listened, sometimes reluctantly, because O'Connor was usually right about what played honestly. His co-star, however, was evolving in the opposite direction. As his confidence grew, so did his willingness to challenge not just lines, but the philosophical direction of scenes. He believed the show needed to be unmistakable in its condemnation of Archie's worldview. Ambiguity, in his view, risked misinterpretation. To him, the danger was not oversimplification. It was subtlety being mistaken for endorsement. This difference might have remained manageable if it stayed confined to rehearsal rooms. But over time, it began to surface during live tapings. Improvised lines altered the balance of scenes. Jokes landed harder, sharper, sometimes undercutting Archie rather than exposing him. For an actor like O'Connor, who built performances beat by beat, this was destabilizing. It wasn't about ego. It was about control of meaning. There was one incident, frequently cited by crew members, where O'Connor objected to a scene he felt crossed that line. He asked for adjustments. His co-star refused. The episode aired largely unchanged. To the audience, nothing seemed wrong. To O'Connor, it confirmed a pattern, one where his interpretation of the character was being slowly overridden. The tension never erupted publicly. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors. Instead, something colder settled in. O'Connor became more guarded on set. Conversations shortened, trust narrowed. Other cast members noticed the shift and tried to soften it, but the divide was no longer just about performance style. It was about ownership, of the character, of the message, of the legacy being built. What made this especially painful was that O'Connor still believed in the partnership. He never phoned it in. Scene after scene, he delivered the same precision, the same emotional weight. The work remained immaculate, but off-camera, the relationship was thinning, stretched by a growing sense that they were no longer telling the same story. And then came the moment that changed everything, not on set, but in public, when words spoken outside the show cut deeper than any argument ever could. The words that could not be taken back for years. The tension stayed contained within the walls of the studio. It was uncomfortable but manageable. Then, without warning, it spilled into the public sphere. And once it did, there was no way to pull it back. During an interview about the cultural impact of All in the Family, Carroll O'Connor's co-star was asked a familiar question. What did Archie Bunker represent? At first, the answer sounded routine, even thoughtful. But then the tone shifted. He began to distance himself not only from the character, but from the idea that Archie deserved any degree of sympathy. Archie was described as dangerous, as a symbol of thinking that should be rejected outright rather than examined. The implication was clear. The character was not a mirror. He was a warning. To the public, it sounded like commentary. To Carroll O'Connor, it felt like betrayal. O'Connor had spent years carefully shaping Archie as a human contradiction. Archie was ignorant, yes, but he was also wounded, shaped by poverty, fear, and inheritance. He was not meant to be admired, but neither was he meant to be dismissed as a cartoon villain. O'Connor believed that flattening Archie into something purely toxic destroyed the moral complexity that made the show matter in the first place. What hurt most was not disagreement. It was timing and exposure. The comments were widely quoted, repeated in newspapers and television segments, stripped of nuance. Suddenly, O'Connor found himself defending not just a character, but his own integrity. Whispers followed him. Some viewers began to conflate Archie's views with the actor who played him. O'Connor denied it repeatedly, but the damage lingered. Friends later said he felt abandoned. The man who had built his career in direct opposition to Archie's worldview now seemed to be stepping away from the very foundation that made that opposition meaningful. Worse still, O'Connor believed those comments erased the shared responsibility of the work. Archie Bunker had not been created in isolation. He was the result of collaboration, trust, and mutual risk. And now, in O'Connor's eyes, that collaboration was being quietly disowned. He never responded publicly. No rebuttal interviews. No pointed remarks. Instead, he withdrew. In subsequent conversations, he stopped using his co-star's name altogether. When asked about the cast, he praised the writers, the producers, Gene Stapleton, anyone except the man who had stood opposite him for years. This was not a cooling-off period. It was a decision. Privately, O'Connor confided to friends that he felt left alone to defend the character they had built together. He had accepted the burden of misunderstanding for years, believing the work would speak for itself. Hearing that work publicly reframed as something harmful felt like a line had been crossed, not professionally, personally. From that point forward, the silence became deliberate. And silence, for Carroll O'Connor, was never accidental. The partnership had survived creative tension. It did not survive public disavowal. The scene that made the silence tragic. Long before the silence hardened, there was one moment that proved how deeply Carroll O'Connor and his co-star could still connect when trust was allowed to exist. It came quietly, without promotion, buried inside an episode that at first seemed unremarkable. But for those who understand the history of All in the Family, this scene would later feel almost unbearable to watch. The episode was Two's a Crowd, airing during the later stretch of the series. The setup was simple. Archie and Mike stayed behind to close Archie's place. By accident, they locked themselves inside the storeroom overnight. No audience spectacle, no big confrontation, just two men, a bottle of liquor, and time. What happened next was not written the way it appeared on screen. As the night wore on, the conversation turned inward. Archie, usually guarded and combative, began to talk about where his beliefs came from. He did not defend them, he explained them. He spoke about his father, about learning hatred the same way one learns to throw a ball or tie a shoe, not through cruelty, but through trust. He described growing up so poor during the Great Depression that he wore one shoe and one boot to school, earning the nickname Shoe Booty. He recalled being locked in a closet as punishment, not with anger, but with resignation. Years later, Carroll O'Connor revealed that much of that dialogue was improvised. So was his co-star's response. There were no notes, no rehearsal tricks, no safety net. What made the scene work was trust, the kind that only exists when two actors listen instead of perform. In that moment, Mike stopped arguing. He stopped correcting, he simply listened. For the first time in the series, Archie was not a target or a symbol. He was a man shaped by inheritance, fear, and pain. The effect was permanent. From that episode forward, Mike's tone toward Archie softened. Not approval, understanding. For viewers, it was one of the most emotionally devastating moments the show ever produced. For O'Connor, it was proof that Archie Bunker's humanity had always been the point. That prejudice was not born in isolation, but passed down like poison through generations. And that is what makes the later silence so tragic. Because this scene showed what the partnership could be when ego disappeared. It showed respect. It showed empathy. It showed two men capable of holding complexity without destroying it. In retrospect, it feels like a reconciliation that only happened on screen. After that episode, the distance off camera only grew. The irony was cruel. The deepest moment of connection between Archie and Mike arrived just as the real relationship between the actors was fracturing beyond repair. What should have been remembered as a shared triumph became, for O'Connor, a reminder of something lost. When later interviews reduced Archie to something dangerous, something to be rejected outright, this scene stood in silent contradiction. It proved that the character had never been simple, and it proved that the understanding once existed, even if it would not survive outside the script. The audience remembered the moment as growth. Carroll O'Connor remembered it as truth, and truth, once abandoned, is not easily forgiven. The silence after fame. When All in the Family finally ended, it closed one of the most important chapters in television history. For the audience, it was the end of a beloved ritual. For the cast, it marked a separation that would quietly define the rest of their lives. Carroll O'Connor did not walk away from Archie Bunker. He carried him forward. When the story transitioned into Archie Bunker's place, O'Connor remained committed, not out of nostalgia, but conviction. He believed that uncomfortable characters still mattered. that television should not smooth out the rough edges of human behavior simply to be palatable. Even later, when he found new success In the Heat of the Night, the shadow of Archie followed him, sometimes as praise, sometimes as burden. His former co-star moved in a different direction entirely. He stepped away from acting and into directing, then producing, then shaping films that would define a generation. His rise was swift and undeniable. Awards followed, prestige followed, influence followed, and as his career expanded, his past quietly narrowed. In interviews celebrating his achievements, All in the Family was referenced carefully, often broadly. The show was acknowledged, its cultural impact was praised, but one name, again and again, was absent. The man who had shared the screen with him in nearly every episode was rarely mentioned. And Carroll O'Connor noticed. At industry events, when the show was honored, O'Connor always spoke with generosity. He named Norman Lear. He named Gene Stapleton. He praised the writers, the crew, the risk they all took together. But he never spoke his former co-star's name. Not once. Reporters picked up on it. Colleagues noticed the pattern. It was not bitterness. It was restraint. Friends later said this was not about pride. It was about boundaries. O'Connor believed something fundamental had been broken, not by creative disagreement, but by erasure. He felt that the work they built together had been reframed without him, and that he had been left to carry the moral weight of a character others were now distancing themselves from. When asked directly in later interviews whether he missed working with the cast, O'Connor answered carefully. "Some of them," he said. When pressed specifically about the man who played his on-screen son-in-law, he paused. The boy did a good job. No name, no warmth, no elaboration. That choice was intentional. O'Connor was precise with language. Silence for him was not absence. It was meaning. When he died in 2001, tributes poured in from across the television world. Writers spoke of his discipline. Actors praised his generosity. Norman Lear called him irreplaceable. But one voice was missing. There was no public tribute, no statement, no appearance at the funeral. So here is the question for you. Was Carroll O'Connor right to draw that line and never cross it again, or should the past have been laid to rest? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next untold chapter behind television history.